Welcome to Pre-Algebra. Today we're going to be starting with Unit 1, Lesson 1, and that's going to be talking about perfect squares and square roots. Remember, if you don't understand any of the lessons that you watch, to make an appointment at the Genius Bar, and let's get started with it right now. Our perfect squares and square roots. Let's take a look at key ideas. So a couple of key ideas we have here. The first one is, what does squared mean? When we talk about squared, that means a number times itself. Then we need to take a look at, what does square root mean? And square root means that any number which when multiplied by itself equals the number. Now let's take a look at a few perfect squares. So here we are looking at some perfect squares as well as their inverse operation, square roots. So we've got 1 squared, so when I have 1 squared, or 1 times 1, that's going to give me 1. The inverse operation of that is the square root. So the square root of 1 is 1. Now looking at 8 squared, when I do 8 squared, 8 times 8 is going to give me 64. And the inverse operation of that is 64 square rooted is going to be 8. So again, squaring and square rooting are inverse operations, or they're the opposite of each other. So looking at my next number there, which is 3 squared, 3 times 3 is 9. And the inverse operation, the square root of 9 is going to be 3. Finally, our last number there, 13 squared. So I'm going to multiply those together and get 169. The square root of 169, again, the inverse operation is going to be 13. Now let's take a look at an important definition. Here we are with our definition of a perfect square. A perfect square is a whole number whose square root is an integer, and a perfect square cannot be negative. It's very important to know that perfect squares cannot ever be negative. Remember, if you take a negative number and multiply it by itself, so negative 3 times negative 3, that's going to give you a positive number. So you're not going to have a square root of negative 9. Now let's take a look at example A. Let's take a look at example A. Example A says, place each of the following square roots on the number line. So we've got the square root of 2, square root of 70, and so on. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out what those square roots are. Rather than just trying to guess where they'll end up on the number line, I'm going to use my calculator. So when I take the square root of 2, I get 1.41, so on and so forth. That's why I have those 3 dots. Those 3 dots state that it goes on forever and ever, but it doesn't repeat. I'm not going to be able to write the entire number on the screen, so I'm going to just use those 3 dots. When I type the square root of 70 in my calculator and hit square root, I get 8.366, or 36, on and on and on, with the dots. The square root of 36 is a perfect square, and that is 6. The square root of 21 is not, and I get 4.58, so on and so forth. The square root of 17 is 4.12, so on and so forth. And the square root of 63 is 7.933. So now that I've figured out all of my square roots, I'm now going to have to place them on the number line, because that is what the question asked me to do. So I'm going to start with letter A and the square root of 2. So I'm going to take my 1.41, I'm looking at my number line, and I'm going to put it somewhere between 1 and 2, probably closer towards the middle, but not quite, because it's not 1.5. So I'm going to go ahead and put a dot there on the number line, and I'm going to label that A, because we were talking about letter A. Could you write the square root of 2? Sure, but since they gave you the letter of A, that's the label I'm going to use. Then we're going to go to 8.36, so again, between 8 and 9, probably closer towards 8, and I'm going to go ahead and put a dot, and I'm going to label that B. The square root of 36 is 6. I can put that right at the 6 and label that C. 4.58 is between 4 and 5, a little bit past the 4.5 mark. So I'm going to go ahead and put a dot there and call that D. Square root of 17 is 4.12, so that's going to be closer to 4 than D was, and I'm going to label that E. And then I've got F is 7.93, so that's very close to 8, but not quite, and I'm going to go ahead and put my dot and label that F. So now I have all of my points labeled on my number line, and I've go ahead and completed this question. Let's move on to the next one. Now here in example B, we're talking about consecutive integers. And it says, between which 2 consecutive integers does the expression fall? So perfect squares are easy. When we had the square root of 36 in the last question, the answer was 6, and we were able to put that number right in the number line. However, not all numbers are perfect squares. So when we don't have perfect squares, we have to say between which two consecutive integers does that fall. So now we need to know what consecutive integers are. And consecutive integers are integers that follow each other in order, like 1 and 2, or 3 and 4, or 9 and 10. Those numbers are in order, they're consecutive, they're one right after the other, so those are consecutive integers. So we're talking about the square root of 20. We're going to go ahead and type that in our calculator, and when we do that, we know that it's going to be a decimal that gets us between 4 and 5. Now, we could type that in our calculator, get a decimal, and see if that decimal is between 4 and 5, or we could take a look at that number that's being square rooted and figure out between which two perfect squares it falls. So the square root of 16 is 4, so that's on one side, and the perfect square of 25 is 5, that's on the other side. 20 is right in the middle, so that we know that is between 4 and 5. I don't have to use a calculator to do that. I can type that in and get a decimal. That will work. That is a way to do the problem. However, it's a lot easier to just think about which perfect squares it is between. So the square root of 58 is between 7 and 8 because 7's perfect square is 49, 8's perfect square is 64, so 58 falls between those two numbers. 106, I'm going to square root that. That's going to be between 10 and 11 because, again, 100 and 121. And the last one, the square root of 11, is going to fall between 3 and 4. Now that we've got all of our answers, let's move on to example C. Now here we are in example C, and it's to circle all the possible values for x in this inequality. So I have x is less than the square root of x, or whatever number we're going to plug in there, is less than 9. So let's take a look. So I've got 6. Now is 6 less than 8? Yeah. Is it less than 9? Yeah. But I'm not looking for 6. I'm looking for the square root of 6. So I have to go ahead and type 6 in my calculator, hit the square root button, and when I do that, I get 2.44, so on and so forth. Again, those 3 dots represent that it's going on and on forever without repeating. However, 2.4 so on and on and on is not between 8 and 9, so that's not a correct answer. So let's take a look at 8.8. So if I type 8.8 in my calculator, is 8.8 between 8 and 9? Yes, but I'm not looking for 8.8. I'm looking for the square root of 8.8. So when I go ahead and type that in my calculator, I get 2.96, so on and so forth. 9.2, at this point I know 9.2 may be more than 9, but I'm not looking for 9.2, I'm looking for the square root of 9.2. So I'm going to type 9.2 in my calculator, hit that square root button, and when I do, I get 3.03 on and forever, and that does not fall between 8 and 9. So far we have no correct answers. Now 64 is interesting. If I hit the square root of 64, I get 8. So that's a perfect square, great. So you think is 8 between 8 and 9. Well, 8 is not greater than 8, so it can't actually fall between 8 and 9 because it's exactly 8. So that is not a correct answer either. So now we've got to go on to 68. Again, I'm going to find the square root. I go ahead and type that in my calculator, 68, square root button, and I get 8.244 repeat, or on and on and on. And 8.24 does fall between 8 and 9, so it took us a while, but we did end up finding our first correct answer. So we're going ahead and circle that one as one of our correct answers. Let's move on to 73. 73, I'm going to go ahead and type that in my calculator, and when I do that, I end up with 8.54 on and on and on. And is that between 8 and 9? Yes, it is, so back-to-back correct answers for us. So let's go ahead and circle that one and move on to 81. Now again, I'm going to hit the square root of 81, and I know that is a perfect square. That perfect square is 9. So again, we run into the same problem that we ran in with 8. 8 is not less than 8, and 9 is not greater than 9 or less than 9. It's exactly 9. So it's not between 8 and 9, so it is not a correct answer. And finally, we're going to type 90 in our calculator, hit that square root button, and we end up with 9.48, going on and on and on forever and ever. And that is not between 8 and 9. So we only have 2 correct answers. Make sure that your paper matches mine. And let's move on to example D. Here we are, we're talking about negative square roots. Wait a minute, I thought you said we couldn't have negative perfect squares. Well, that's true. We can't have negative perfect squares, but we can have negative square roots. So let's take a look at the 3 things that we have here. The first one says we have the square root of 9. When we see the square root of 9, we've seen that before, we know the square root of 9 is 3. That's easy enough. The next one, I have a negative symbol outside my square root. So I have to follow my order of operations here. I have to do my square rooting first and then apply the negative. So the square root of 9 is 3, and then apply the negative, so I get negative 3. In the last one, I've got a plus and a minus in the square root of 9. Huh, that's weird. I've never seen that symbol before. So what they're asking for there when you see the plus and the minus is they're asking for both the positive square root and the negative square root. Negative square root? Well, yes, if you had negative 3 times negative 3, you would end up with positive 9. So you can have a positive or a negative answer and still have the correct answer to the square root of 9. So when I see plus or minus the square root of 9, I need to know I have to have plus 3 and negative 3. I have to have both answers because it's asking me for both answers. If I don't see that symbol, you can assume that they're talking about looking for only the positive answer. But when you see that symbol, you need to apply both answers. That brings us to the end of this video. So if you like this video, go ahead and throw us a thumbs up. If you love this video, go ahead and throw us a sub, and we will catch you in the next one.